This is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional
unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. We are recording this episode on the 18th anniversary of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And we have with us my good friend, esteemed colleague, and distinguished policymaker, William Inboden. Welcome, William.
Good to be here.
Will is a professor of history and public policy at the LBJ School and the University of Texas. He is the executive director of the Clements Center for Strategy and Statecraft. He's also a distinguished fellow with the Strauss Center. And in addition to being an accomplished academic, he's someone who has had an extensive policy career working on the National Security Council for President George W. Bush and doing all sorts of policy work since then. Before we turn to our discussion...
and Jeremy, you forgot to mention any former undergraduate and graduate school classmate of Professor Suri's.
That is true. That is true. One could argue that Will is just the person I followed around from one place to another, including London for one summer as well. Yeah. But before we get lost on those stories, Will, we have a more...
And I knew Zachary before he was a poet. So.
Yes, it's hard to remember what that was. But speaking of Zachary's poetry, Zachary, you have a poem for us to start today, right?
Yeah.
What is the title of your poem?
Ghosts of 9/11, 2001.
Well, let's hear it.
I wasn't there when two planes flew into the Twin Towers at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't there when my mother watched jet fuel rain fire from office building windows from a television screen in a Milwaukee classroom. And I wasn't there when they jumped from 80 stories up to escape being burned alive next to their desk like we heard about on the television screen in the history classroom with video footage from 2 decades ago. And it all seems a bit old to us, fidgeting at our desks, wishing we didn't have to hear about the smell of burning flesh, watching as a plane smashed into a building that collapsed under its weight like Lego bricks. And I wasn't there, on grainy footage with cursing firefighters in the background who seem so old to us now. And I wasn't even breathing when planes blew up financial centers, dive-bombed into the Department of Defense. And I wasn't even there when an explosion rocked a Pennsylvania field. And we just can't imagine it in the humid, fly-swarming classroom 18 years later. We can't imagine what it's like to feel like you are under attack from all directions, to lean against patriotism when you don't know if there could be a bomb in the cereal boxes you pick up from the grocery store. And I read an article the other day about Paul Simon singing the boxer on Saturday Night Live when they were still searching for survivors. And all I can think about is how those piercing lies must have felt through the television sets. And what do you do when you are attacked by a bearded man 7,000 miles away in the Hindu Kush and almost 3,000 people die? And perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps it's good to have known Iraq, to have known Afghanistan all my life. And I guess I can almost measure my age in the length of wars. And perhaps it's a good thing to have grown up patriotized in the Patriot Act, standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, to have grown up in a world where you have to take off your shoes to prove you're not hiding any blaze between your toes, a world where I watch my bearded, dark-skinned father get purposefully randomly selected at every airport stop, where I now, as an adolescent male, have to get my books and my stuffed animals swabbed at London Heathrow like they're going to blow up the skies. And perhaps it's a blessing to have woken up in a minefield and forgotten why we have to get to the other side.
That's a wonderful poem, Zachary.
Very powerful.
What is the message of your poem?
My poem is really about what it's like to be, as I am, in the generation that was born just after 9/11 and has felt the ghost, has been haunted by September 11th, 2001, but hasn't known it and has felt the after effects for so long. And in many ways, it's a very different perspective to think about it as someone who didn't actually experience that event. And it makes one think about the path that we took as a nation afterwards in a much more critical but also much more truthful way.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's a memory that you don't have, but yet it's a memory that structures your life in every way. Will, your career has in many ways been centered on 9/11. Where were you on that day?
I was in Washington, D.C. I had actually just moved there a week or two earlier from Yale. So I was still unpacking boxes in my bachelor pad rented apartment. I had accepted a job with the State Department, but had not started yet because I was awaiting the security clearance. And meanwhile, I was working at the think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. And the morning of 9/11, my morning commute driving into the AEI headquarters would take me right past on Interstate 395, right past the Pentagon. So I'd passed, maybe 150 yards away from the south side of the Pentagon about a half hour before it got hit.
Wow.
So, of course, you have no idea what is coming.
Sure.
But I remember the day for me is just a series of vivid vignettes interspersed with blurriness and trauma. So I remember sitting at my desk at AEI and my intern running up saying, "Hey, a plane hit the World Trade Center." And my immediate thought was, oh, maybe it was like an errant Piper Cub, and it was just an accident.
Right.
And a few minutes later, he came running up and said, "A second plane hit." And all of a sudden, I realized something is going on. And then someone else said, "The Pentagon's been hit." And so I and several colleagues from the think tank run out to the roof of our building, which is just about, it was at 17th and M, so just a few blocks from the White House and a couple miles as the crow flies across the river from the Pentagon. And we get out to the roof and look across towards the Pentagon and see this pillar of black smoke, unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life before. It, felt like Armageddon or just something really, really apocalyptic. And then the panic starts to set in because you wonder, what's next? Are we next? We had no idea at the time about Flight 93. Of course, now we know that was going either for the White House and the Capitol and the heroic passengers who rushed the cabin, saved certainly many other innocent lives in Washington, D.C. I remember running back down to my desk and phoning my parents in Tucson, Arizona. It was 3 hours behind at the time. They had just woken up. They had no idea anything was going on. I remember screaming into the phone, like, "Mom, I'm okay. Don't worry." And she'd, what are you talking about? And I said, "Turn on the TV." And so that's how she found out what was going on. I remember going into Norm Ornstein's office. He's a congressional scholar at AEI, and sitting there with him and several others watching the TV as the Twin Towers came down. Then kind of getting a sense that we needed to evacuate the building, and it was not ordered, but a number of us realized this just doesn't feel safe.
Right.
And I ended up having several hours walk back to my place in Virginia. But remember, going out on the streets of D.C., and there were literally thousands upon thousands of people on the street, and no one was saying a word.
Wow.
It was this eerie silence. All you heard was kind of the clop, clop, clop of shoe leather on the street. Everyone was in shock. Some people are crying, some people hugging each other, but we were still in just this very vivid, literal state of terror and uncertainty. So those are my memories of the day.
Wow, wow. And how long did it take to get a sense of what had actually happened?
By that evening, I remember, the long walk home. That evening, gathering with several other friends at, my bachelor pad and, watching the news.
Right.
And by then, we're starting to realize it was this Al-Qaeda attack. I certainly had heard of Al-Qaeda, knew who they were, but had no idea that they'd be capable of something like this. And then I remember either late that night or early the next morning, I don't know why this thing sticks in my head, Charles Krauthammer's column comes up at the Washington Post, and it was headlined, "This is War."
Right.
And that's the first time it actually sunk into me that there was this war dimension to this. Again, it feels silly to say now that it sort of took that long, but it's a terror attack. You have no category for something like this. Two other fresh vignettes for me in the days and weeks afterwards. One was just the pervasive sense of terror that lasted for months. Being afraid on the metro, on the streets. I remember my first couple of plane flights afterwards. The other was the sense of unity and solidarity. Very palpable, almost hard to describe now.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, almost hard to describe now in our very polarized and divided age. And the divisions, as we can talk about, returned soon enough afterwards, right? But for months afterwards, everything from everyone having American flags in the front yard on their cars, strangers spontaneously hugging each other. Just a real sense of we as a nation pulling together. The political divisions just seem so silly and irrelevant. And again, they returned soon enough. I don't want to be naive about that, but those two kind of intertwined feelings of ongoing terror and ongoing unity and solidarity and how they coexisted. And of course, you'll remember, especially for D.C., I can't remember the exact dates, but within just a few weeks of the 9/11 attacks, you also had the anthrax mailings,
Absolutely.
which again we know now, or we seem to know, were just a lone wolf, and nothing related to Al Qaeda. Fortunately, only killed a few people, but going back to that feeling of terror,
of course.
Oh my goodness, this is next.
Right. I remember being afraid to open the mail, and we were told, I was an assistant professor in my first year then. It's actually my first week teaching American Foreign Relations, and I remember our being told, we had some university circular at the University of Wisconsin saying to wash our hands after we opened our mail.
Wow. And again, it sounds crazy in hindsight, but at the time that made sense, right?
That made perfect sense at the time.
Because that's one of the perverse effects of terrorism, of course, is just how it permanently, it alters your psyche. It makes normal daily actions and interactions in human life so twisted and risk prone. So,
and in addition to being someone who lived through this at ground zero, in a sense, Will, and then someone who had to make policy in response to this, you've also done a lot of research on this period. What do we know now, with the benefit of hindsight and research, about what really happened on that day?
I'm trying to think of what the main highlights would be. I mean, obviously, one of the things that happened was it was a pervasive breakdown in our certainly our intelligence and warning apparatus, right? And the 9/11 Commission, I think, did some really good work showing that. I mean, looking back, if we had connected the dots, we should have known a lot more. I'm not fingering any individual for blame there, but there were just some serious structural problems and a series of
and similar to Pearl Harbor in that sense, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think some of the analogies are compelling there. Certainly has come out just the radical uncertainty and terror that President Bush and himself felt. Certainly, of course, has come out some of the difficult calls that Vice President Cheney made in the bunker there about giving the shoot down order for Flight 93, right? So some of the difficult calls that were made then.
And just for those who might not know, right, the order was given that if there was a chance to shoot down that plane before it struck,
a civilian airliner with innocent civilians on it, but our F-16s were going to shoot it down. So and then I do remember this has come out to give, obviously, I think as a veteran of the Bush administration, I'm hardly unbiased, right? And so I certainly, and by the way, I was not a main policymaker on the counterterrorism, so things I got right, I won't take any credit for either. But I do think that some of the early controversial decisions the Bush administration made, for example, to go into Afghanistan with a light footprint, the special operators working with the Northern Alliance, a lot of warnings that wouldn't work, or it's going to be a quagmire, or things like that, and that it was going to take forever to topple the Taliban. And there were some early tactical and strategic successes there. I do think it's come out that President Bush took some very deliberate, controversial, intentional steps not to demonize Islam.
Right.
So he goes to visit the Washington Mosque just a few days afterwards. He says Islam is a religion of peace and was really vilified by a number on the right for that. But and that was partly his own incorporation of lessons of history. He had read about and been very moved about the appalling internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, and did not want to replicate that with an entire class of American citizens, the vast majority of whom, of course, are very peaceful and patriotic. So those are some of the, like I said, I think the positive things that were difficult calls at the time, but I think it's come out that there was careful deliberation. And many others, of course, that would be less salubrious.
And it should be said, just building on what you said, Will, that there was definitely an effort by the president at the time to apply the lessons of history and really try to limit what could have become a sort of hateful set of attitudes towards those from the Middle East and those who were Muslim. Yeah. But there was evidence also in areas he couldn't control that some hatred was rising, and that there were examples of violence towards certain communities. So you had sort of both things happening at the same time.
And that's again one of the perverse effects of terror, as well as just one of the the tragedies of certainly at least some people in America. I mean, I do remember this sort of sense in the weeks and months afterwards: is our country going to come apart over this? Right? I mean, will we really turn again? Fortunately, we didn't. Fortunately, there was not a mass turning against each other, but there were certainly some different acts of discrimination and violence that were truly appalling.
And as a policymaker, we've talked about this before. I think that experience that you just described so vividly stayed with you, right? When you and your colleagues in various places within the administration and and this would apply to people who then worked for President Obama, I think, right? When they made policy, these memories and perhaps even these feelings were there with you on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yeah, it's a very intensely personal form of learning, quote, the lessons of history in terms of you are living your own personal history. You're remembering your personal history. So it's not just the history that we study and teach about or that happened before we were born, but it's the personal histories that each of us bring. And that certainly my 9/11 experience, continues to shape my thinking about this, but all the more profoundly for Bush, for Condi, for Rumsfeld, for Secretary Powell, for Vice President Cheney. This is not at all to justify every decision they made. Some of them we know in hindsight were, I think, quite erroneous. But that was, I heard, this is not unique to me. I heard a couple of other Bush administration veterans say this, but essentially for President Bush and his senior team, every day for the next 7.5 years was 9/11. Every day was 9/11 in terms of, he knew as the commander-in-chief this had happened on his watch, and he swore, obviously, never again. So if you want to at least understand the kind of existential mindset he was bringing to bear, that was that. That does not justify every decision.
Of course not, but it helps to at least explain it, right? Zachary, you had a question?
Well, we're talking about sort of the aftermath of 9/11 and some of the decisions that were made. What do you see really as the missed opportunities in many ways of 9/11? But also the opportunities that were really capitalized on.
Yeah. A few missed opportunities, I'll say, and I hope this doesn't sound too much like armchair quarterbacking. I'll put a little bit of this on myself. Some of these I've gone on record before. So I think there was a missed opportunity to do a robust post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction effort in Afghanistan. I understand the original light footprint strategy, it worked, but in the sort of 2003 to 2006 window, there was a missed opportunity there, and we're still, I don't know that a perfect outcome could have been had, but it wasn't fully tried. That relates to the second missed opportunity, and perhaps the biggest tragedy was the Iraq War. Again, I'm on record as saying this. I was a strong supporter of the war at the time. Knowing on what we thought we knew at the time, I now think the war was a mistake, and I understand the mindset that went into it, but I think it was a mistake and contributed quite a bit to the subsequent partisan divisions in our country. Those were already creeping in 2002 with things like the Patriot Act and Guantanamo and some of the other stuff, but that would be another one. Third missed opportunity, this came up at our counterterrorism panel yesterday. 3 administrations now, Obama, Trump, and Bush, have all failed to develop a really robust counter-radicalization strategy. We've gotten very good as a country at killing and capturing terrorists and potential terrorists. We have not figured out how to prevent the radicalization process itself. And it's a very hard question. There's only so much a government can do, but that's another missed opportunity I would point to. And then finally, I would point to not so much the missed opportunity, but the dissipated opportunity of the national unity we had.
Yes.
So it was so palpable when we had it, and it's so painful when it's gone. And there's plenty of blame to go around on all sides. So.
And partisanship is as American as apple pie, of course. Yeah. But are there things that could have been done not simply by one side, but maybe by both sides of the aisle and by people who were not very politically active that could have allowed that unity to last longer?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. I'll try to be even-handed about this. And again, obviously, all these things are complicated. On the Bush administration side, I think a couple of related mistakes were not going to Congress sooner on some of the terrorist surveillance programs. Again, arguable about whatever your doctrine of Article 2 and executive power is on if that was actually required. But prudentially, it would have been a really good idea to get congressional authorization because they would have gotten it. Right. Especially for 215 and 702, if we want to get into the legal stuff of the Patriot Act. Similarly, in some ways, I know this is getting into much more fraught territory, and I'm still quite torn on this, but on the enhanced interrogation methods or torture, again, I know the terms themselves are contested. When those were briefed to the intelligence committees, there actually was bipartisan support. Again, I understand the mindset at the time. I mean, when you really do worry about the next attacks coming and you're feeling this strong sense of anger over that. But eventually those became partisan issues and also moral stains on our country. Right. Likewise, I'd say probably with the Guantanamo facility. Interestingly, and Jeremi, I've been doing a lot of talking. If I can put this to you, but here's my observation and a question to you if you think I'm right in your reflections on this. Early on, the Bush administration did decide that the Cold War was the nearest approximation of a historical paradigm as far as long-term battle of ideas, kinetic dimensions, ideological dimension, some localized hot wars, the need to create new institutions, all that, so on and so forth. And I do think that one very important part historically about the Cold War containment strategic consensus coming in was the fact that you had a Republican Eisenhower following a Democrat Truman. Eisenhower runs against a lot of Truman's policies in the 52 campaign, then turns around and essentially adopts him as president, with some nuances, obviously. Similarly, I do think that the Obama administration, after criticizing on the campaign trail a lot of the Bush administration's more robust counterterrorism measures, did end up adopting quite a bit of them. He did keep Guantanamo open. He still was doing renditions, certainly, up in the drone strikes, things like that, as well as the overall legal framework, kept the Patriot Act, things like that. And that did help some sort of bipartisan consensus settle in on maintaining a certain strategic framework and set of institutions for counterterrorism. Again, we could nuance it and quibble all sorts, but in the main, that's my take. I wonder if you would see it similarly.
I would say, just building on what you said, Will, so well, I think there was not enough work done to educate the public about these issues. And that's easy to say in retrospect. Yeah. And of course, in a sense, it's impossible when decision makers are confronted with so many issues and under the kinds of stress that you described. You gave us a wonderful window into how difficult that life is. Yeah. But I think one of the challenges that we have today is we have a public that's probably as ignorant of foreign affairs and these issues as ever in our recent history, in spite of it being a very educated public. Yeah. And so I think I think that's part of the issue. And I think many of the examples you were giving, it's not so much which position one would take, but can we have a robust discussion of this? And I think that really broke down during the Obama years, perhaps in part because of the White House, but also in part because of the way I think Mitch McConnell wanted to run the Republican Party and the Republican Party's position on these issues.
Plenty of blame to go around.
Right. And so I think that's one of the reasons the unity didn't last. I do think unity requires a certain understanding and trust.
Yeah, it did. So I will say, sorry, just because I went through a whole number of missed opportunities. Let me say to be even out of the record, and I've said this in other venues before, the fact that we're sitting here on the 18-year anniversary of 9/11, and there has not been another large-scale mass casualty attack on the United States itself since then is, I do think, a remarkable achievement, a very bipartisan one across three administrations of both parties in Congress. And again, I go back to the other palpable sense we had in the days and weeks after 9/11 was not if we'll get hit again, but when will we get hit again? You just assumed it was happening. And so the fact that didn't is no accident.
I agree. I guess what is often hard for us, even as scholars, I think, and certainly as citizens, and especially as young people like Zachary, to understand is how much did we protect ourselves? And how much did we exaggerate the threat? And that's not to criticize people for exaggerating the threat. I think you've given us a very good reason to empathize with those who, including you and I at the time, Will, were convinced there would be another attack. Oh, yeah. But to what extent did we perhaps exaggerate what might have been a somewhat diabolical but also lucky strike on the United States on that day?
That's, I don't want to trivialize any of this, but Bin Laden and the 19 hijackers were incredibly lucky, too. In addition to a number of other factors. Yeah, and in some ways, that's an impossible question to answer as far as how much is the lack of another attack a success of U.S. policy contingent on that, or how much is it just the fact that the threat wasn't that bad after that one moment? And I still would lean more towards the former. I will, but it's an important debate to have. It's an important question for scholars to ask, especially now as we're in the moment where the new emerging strategic consensus is the security environment is about the great power competition. And jihadist terrorism anyway is still out there, but is more of a second-order concern. Overall, I generally share that consensus, but I do worry we might be overlooking the reemergence of ISIS and some resilience with Al-Qaeda, and I don't want to see any more of this, but all it would take was one. They certainly have the intention to do another large-scale attack. I don't know if they have that capability.
Or certainly a weak actor can still inflict a great deal of harm.
Yeah.
That's certainly one lesson that it seems is undeniable. Yeah. What are some other lessons from this period? Lessons as we think, not simply about where we position ourselves in our politics, but we think about our country moving forward. For Zachary's generation, many of them are listening to us. What should they take from this as lessons?
Yeah, I hope this doesn't sound too much like patriotic pablum, but I certainly came to a new appreciation of America, of our resilience, of the unity we're capable of as a country, knowing that that's possible. Knowing the fact that we were targeted rather than so many other countries in the world, partly because of our virtues, I do think, which are inimical to the perverse jihadist vision. So in that sense, it actually gave me certainly the outpouring of interest in national service and public service once afterwards, and that's not just about military enlistments, but
of course, firefighters, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Policemen, educators, right? It was a painful shock to the national conscience that also reminded us of living for something larger than ourselves, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose that. I don't think we fully have. That's one reason why you and I are so blessed to be teachers here at the University of Texas, right? We're reminded of that every day. But that was kind of dissipated in the 1990s. We all were becoming a little fat and happy and lazy in the 90s. I don't want to overtake that too far. And the trauma of 9/11 also, brought out the better possibilities.
Right. Is there a way you think? I agree with everything you said and said it so well. But is there a way, perhaps, that 9/11 and our legitimate and empathetic responses to it also contributed maybe to some of the xenophobia we see today and the obsession with keeping certain people out of the country that seems to be part of our rhetoric? Or do you think those are separate things?
I would somewhat say they're separate, but lest that sound too ignorant, because as you know, I was emphatically opposed to that really awful Muslim ban that just imposed just about everything that Trump has pushed. But I do think that the impulses that candidate Trump was tapping into in 2016 were a little more of a recent vintage, maybe targeted at some of the domestic, the homegrown terrorism issues we'd had with Orlando, San Bernardino. Right. In terms of, these were not directly tied to 9/11, but rather to some of the more recent ones. And I do wish the Obama administration had been a little more forthcoming about some of the ideological roots. I don't blame them for this at all, but also think that certainly for some of the more nativist and xenophobic elements, especially in the Republican Party. I was surprised and very disturbed at those elements, but I don't trace them directly back to 9/11. Okay. I think they were a little more recent vintage, but I'm still puzzling over that, frankly. Right. Partly because it was so shocking to me.
Right. It's just that's a great answer. It's just I struggle to understand how a party that was built around free trade and in a sense a party that was about open movement of people and capital became in a relatively short period a party that not just its leading figure but many elements of the party seem to be opposed to those things. And
yeah, it's our friends in the government department are going to have years and years of dissertations to produce in terms of sort of how malleable is political identity and conviction and voting patterns.
Right.
Yeah,
well said. Zachary, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Well, it's not really a question. It's more, I think, of more of a comment. I think it's really interesting to me how formative 9/11 is to so many things in our society, and I'm just curious and interested what both of you would say to the idea that what are the effects of young people today being defined so much by 9/11, but also not having experienced it, and what new perspective does that give young people who didn't experience it in such a personal way?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, Will, you work with a lot of undergraduates who study foreign policy with you, but yet they didn't have this experience. They were barely alive.
Yeah, no, that's one of the ways I track the passing of time is, each entering class in the fall, what are their memories of 9/11? And look, now we have some freshmen here who, since his 18th anniversary, literally were born afterwards. Right, and certainly none of them will actually remember it. I guess I'll first say, Zachary, it is I hope no future students will ever have a firsthand memory of something like this. In terms of it's a blessing to not have to have a firsthand memory or experience of this, right? So let's be thankful for that. This is no excuse for historical ignorance. Of course, I want everyone to be able to know about it. But just as my generation was blessed to not have lived through Pearl Harbor, right? I mean, you just don't want to visit these sort of traumas again. But it should still be studied, talked about, passed on. Whether for the lessons about how horribly wrong things can go, for the lessons about the dangerous possibilities in the world, but also how these things can be prevented and the virtues that can come out of it of national unity and service and so on. So it's hard to get the balance right.
I think there's a real blessing, as Will said, in not having lived through this, but there's a real danger in it being important to our society and you're not having lived through it. The blessing is that it doesn't define your generation, and I do think, Will might not fully agree with this, but I do think that there's a more openness to people who look different and come from Muslim communities among your generation, Zachary, because you don't have this image of Muslim terrorists that we have, those of us who lived through 9/11. It's hard to avoid that. Even though one knows that image is not representative, that image is sort of seared in our minds. And that's not true. I find that's not true with my undergraduates. On the other hand, I do think, and this is true for all kinds of actors, because it's clearly important to where we are as a society now. We still have soldiers in Afghanistan. We still have Guantanamo as a prison for those we are accusing of terrorism and other acts. It's with us. And because there's questions over what actually happened for those who didn't live through it, it's malleable for political purposes. And this is not unique to 9/11. Political actors will use historical memory to justify different positions. And I do think it's often, maybe dishonestly, used in our immigration debate, used in our debates about who's an American citizen. To be very frank about it, I think the Trump administration manipulates the memory of 9/11 in inconsistent ways. But ways that I think can be powerful because of the ignorance that some have. So Will's final point, I think, was absolutely right, being educated about this and hearing people like Will who lived through it but also have had the good fortune to be able to sit back and reflect upon it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, watching some of the footage from 9/11 yesterday with you, but also like in school, I think it's really interesting to sort of watch the footage because at first it's something it's very inspiring, it's very patriotic, and it's very emotional, but at the same time it's also in many ways very testosterone heavy.
It's definitely gendered.
Yeah, and in many ways it's something that in many ways I think added to the almost militaristic patriotism that I feel like is something that we've seen more of. And I don't know if I would necessarily say that like the Trump administration has been playing off of the after effects of 9/11, but I think that one of the real things that Trump has tapped into is this sort of leftover almost militaristic patriotism.
Will, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I was in part. I guess I'm still trying to get my mind around everything Trump is about because he's so full of contradictions, right? I mean, on the one hand, there's the militarism and the bellicosity. On the other hand, there's I think almost this overeagerness to meet with some of the bad guys of the world, such as Kim Jong-un, as well as this desire to bring all the troops home, and I think leave us at real potential risk in Afghanistan and Syria. So
right?
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe you want the political benefits and image of it without the political cost and effectiveness of it. I also did want to come back to this question of Islam and the Muslim ban and xenophobia there, because I remember a few years ago I won't say where, but I was speaking to a large audience in a conservative rural region, and one of the questioners, I was talking about counterterrorism 9/11, and one of the questions had asked, a rather piercing, hateful question about should we just kind of get rid of all deport all the Muslims, and I respond by saying, listen, we need to say three things about Islam and terrorism. First, yes, it is true that the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11, a number of us did it in the name of Islam. Right. It's a perversion, but we need to acknowledge that, and that a certain small subset of that faith has been radicalized. So we need to be honest about that on their own terms. Second, and he was nodding then. I said, yeah. Second, I'm not done. Numerically, and I think even kind of spiritually, the biggest victims of terrorism are Muslims. Sure. If you just look at who the jihadists usually are targeting, it's other Muslims. And third, some of America's most courageous, principled, important allies in the fight against terrorism are Muslims. And I said, you notice why you won't hear many American veterans or troops talking about the Muslim ban? Because they've served alongside Muslims, right. Courageous Iraqis, courageous Afghans, given their lives to their country, given their lives for a peaceful interpretation of their faith. And we will not win this fight without them. Mm-hmm. And so anytime I hear, jingoistic, politicians call it, Islam itself is the entire problem, I emphatically reject that. It's normatively wrong, but it's empirically false too.
And I think that point about it being empirically false is one of the lessons we need to take from this, that There are bad actors in the world. They have all different kinds of sizes and shapes. Some are Muslim, some are white Christian American, some are Jewish, right? And one of the things we've struggled with since 9/11 is sorting that out, sorting out the bad actors from the categories, which in some ways give cover to the bad actors. Right?
Yeah. And in the last year, just speaking of this terrorism thing in general, we're now having to really, as a nation, wrestle with that we need to shift our paradigm some on terrorism and confront much more this very ugly white nationalist terrorism. It was, of course, El Paso being the most recent example, but even if you look at just kind of FBI, crime and terrorist tracking statistics, they're now tracking larger numbers of white nationalist, terrorist actors than they are even jihadists. And again, I don't want to downplay at all the ongoing threat, especially from ISIS and Al Qaeda. But the only good news I suppose I can say there is at least some of the tools and methods we learned in fighting jihadist terrorism can now hopefully be effectively brought to bear there. So.
And that's a great point, that the lessons of this historical experience, this traumatic moment that you described so vividly for us, Will, there are lessons in there, first of all, in understanding threats, but also in the different things we can do and should do and the things we shouldn't do. Yeah. Zachary, is this something that animates your generation? I know you said today at school you had some conversations about this. Maybe it's because you were wearing a hat.
I mean, I really think that it does, and part of it is just the event itself, and it's very it's a very interesting dynamic to learn about 9/11 in school, because in school we're almost always taught about events that happened before our parents were born, or about events in a very abstract sense. But when 9/11 is taught, especially in a very pragmatic sense, about the deaths and in a very emotional way, it's something that I think really touches people and kids and really inspires them, but also in many ways I think teaches us all very important lessons. And I think it's really powerful. And I think we can't lose that opportunity as we move farther and farther away from 9/11.
Right. And I think that's a perfect note to close on, because so much of what we've learned in this wonderful conversation is that we're still grappling with this history. Will said that so many times. Your poem was about that, Zachary. And it is the willingness to revisit these issues, to struggle through understanding them, that helps to make us better. And it's why it's usually the next generation, your generation, Zachary, that actually will find more wisdom in this than we have.
If I can add one closing thought on particularly on that, is my rough rule of thumb as far as when does something become history is usually about one generation, about 20 years. And we're just about coming to that moment in terms of that's enough time when we can start to have a little bit more of a dispassionate assessment, take a fresher look, see how the passage of time, what has transpired since then, practically more archives opening, things like that. And so, it's a rough rule of thumb. It's not finally calibrated. The point being, Zachary, we're just now entering the window when you and your generation can take up a new assessment of 9/11 as history. Yes. And I think there's a lot of new insights to be had there.
And that history will make us a better country as we understand it better. Well, thank you for joining us, Will, and sharing these very emotional memories with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to play a small part in This Is Democracy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.